Hello everyone, thank you for having me. So I'm as well a member of the CAAD chair, and in principle we share a lot of interest with Goa and Carla. Yeah? So it's a kind of a setup which is from Zurich and from Vienna, and I think you should know all these things. But in principle what brings us all together is a kind of interest in the digital, in information technologies, in big data, and so on. So how these phenomena are changing the way we relate to the world. So how is this world with information different? So what we have today is, in principle, is the ability that everyone is connected, that everyone has the access to all this information, and to the infinite streams of data. So how, in this kind of setup, if we have access to all this information and so on, how do we start talking about things we care? So I think this is one of the important questions. So anyone in principle can tell a good story. If we have big data, we can kind of squeeze it, stretch it, and so on, and we are able to tell any story we like. So all the data is on our fingertips, but it doesn't make any sense to argue because we have all the arguments on our fingertips. So this is a kind of a paradox. And what I want to talk today is how we deal with a lot. So how do we deal with the big plenty, with big data, with the abundance of information, the great many, and so on. And in this case, I think, as probably Goa and Carla already mentioned, so if we think of computation as a kind of a literacy, this is an entrance point towards all this data and information. So what I want today is to tell a story how to play with a lot by playing with, let's say, 3 different kinds of media, but in principle to tell the same story how to deal with a lot. So how to deal with pixels, voxels, and atom letters. So if we are dealing with voxels, it's around, let's say, kind of chairs. If we are dealing with pixels, it's around images. And atom letters, they are around text. But in principle, these are not separate things. So if we are dealing with pixels, we can find them in atom letters, and if we are dealing with voxels, we can find them in different places. So they are kind of an elements with which we are able to construct alphabets and these kind of things. In this context, I think it's very interesting to think and to see, for instance, what is the etymology of the word a lot. So I find this very beautiful. So a lot can mean like a parcel, a slot, a lot. So it's a parcel. And then it's an object that is used to determine someone's share. So what would this mean? You can imagine, for instance, that you have a river, and then let's say that this river is called Nile, and then we have a flood. And this flood takes all the parcels, takes all the lots, so you don't know anymore what's going on. Then you create a new set of lots, but now you need to give them to people. So what do? You say, okay, we are going to encode each of these lots on a small stick. And then we will put these sticks in a hat, and we will kind of shake them a little bit, and then each one will choose. He will get a lot by playing lotto. So I think here we already have 2 interesting concepts. So a lot as a parcel, and then we have a lot as a way of encoding a piece of land, so encoding, and then we play lotto in order to find this piece of land. So it's a kind of a game of chance on this. And then the latest kind of meanings of this word is a kind of a group or a collection, or what they say here, the great many. And the great many is then a direct connection to the big plenty, or to the abundance of data, to information, and so on. So what I find this here interesting is that you have all these 3 very interesting aspects. You have a game of chance, a lotto, you have an encoding on a stick, and you have a game of playing with the many. So I think it's a kind of a nice setting to start talking about what it might be to talk about a lot. So it's a kind of, I want to create a kind of an ambience for the discussion. And the story I want to tell, in principle, it's not scientific directly, it's not artistic, but I would say that it's architectural in a way of bringing both of these together. So it's a kind of a mixture of both. And it plays with existing elements, and it's architectural in its gesture of bringing these elements together in relation. So it's a kind of an articulation of constellations with ever increasing amount of parts. And of course, then we have a challenge. How do we deal with this? Yeah? How do we play with the abundance of information? Or how do we even start thinking in these terms? If you have any questions during the talk, you can stop me and just kind of ask whatever you like. So in order to create a kind of an ambience for this setting, I want to talk a little bit about aliens, mutants, migrants, and avatars, because I think these kind of creatures, they inhabit this space of information, the space of abundance, and so on. So they are neither mortal, not immortal. Yeah? They don't come from the heaven, or they don't come from earth. But what can become interesting if we start asking ourselves, like, what do these guys do? What kind of objects do they use? What kind of creatures do they mingle with? What kind of nature is their nature? So is their nature different than our nature or not? Or like what are these kind of relationships? And the interesting thing is, of course, that there is more and more of them. Yeah? And the more you try to see what they are about, somehow it's more difficult to understand what the whole story with them is about. And I think this is because they are never pure. Yeah? So they always come in different kind of mixtures of different media, of different kind of creatures, of different kind of atmospheres, and so on. Different concepts. And I think this is exactly what makes them interesting. Yeah? But on the other hand, this what makes them interesting is this what makes them impossible to understand. So they are, in a way, beyond classical categories. So you cannot put them certain labels, put them in boxes, put them in certain places. They are more like atmospheres, more like crystals, and these kind of things. So we could say that they live on the Google planet, on internet, and they hang out with other avatars and with other aliens. So the way how they communicate, how they socialize, how they show what are their faces, is, let's say, with the social media. And as well, I think they are very good with branding. So they know how to put different masks, how to talk in different ways, and yeah. But on the other hand, they are not. So they are actual and virtual. They are able to render themselves in different ways. So for instance, you can trade with them. They use bitcoins as money, and so on. And they like internet very much. Huh? They like web. They like information. So maybe they are information, or not, or maybe they are like us. Yeah? So they are in between the virtual and the actual. And the way how we look at them makes them different. Yeah? So they can show many faces. So maybe they are actually us, because what we get with information is that we are able to have multiple faces, multiple avatars. And if you look at the social media and people that do it, they have a lot of different profiles for whatever they are doing. Yeah? A lot of different masks and different identities, and they know how to play with them. And I like these kind of stories. And these guys, they live in a story like this one. Yeah? So this is Alice in Wonderland from Tim Burton. And I was thinking, okay, since I like these guys, maybe I could design a chair for them. So what kind of a chair would I design for Alice in Wonderland? Yeah? So it's definitely a chair which is in between different worlds. So this one This one is in Tim Burton's movie, and this one is in my living room. So one is from silver, the other one is from gold. But of course, it's not real silver or real gold. It's a kind of how we tune the rendering. So how we tune the rendering, we get a different result, whatever we like. It depends on the setup of our rendering. And of course, as well, the form of these chairs is not fixed. So they can have many different forms. They can exist on different scales, in different realities, in different resolutions. So this one is super, super small. It's a kind of microscopic level. And this one is kind of too big. This one is in the museum, in the Vitra Museum, but it's very, very big. I mean, not too big, but big enough. Or we can put them in drawings. So what I find interesting is that both the avatars and the chairs, so they, in a way, kind of live on the Google planet. They are, in a way, informational objects, so we can compute with them. They are computational objects. And this means that they can have many different faces depending on the mood and depending on the setup there is. But how? The question is how do we start playing with these things? And I think, for instance, here it gets interesting when we start talking about the design of chairs. And if we design chairs within the digital, then we are, in a way, leaving design which is based on specific details, which is based on specific materials, which is based on a specific scale, and so on. And we are entering in another space where, for instance, the materiality of objects can be imposed at any time on them. So what becomes a kind of a context for thinking and for working with these kind of chairs is a database. So we take all the chairs, all of those guys and all of those guys. We take them all and they become like a database for our alien chairs. And of course, as I said, this is all happening on the Google planet. So we can call this location where it's happening a database or a kind of a container of probabilities. So from this, we can render any kind of a chair that we like. Of course, not any, but from a certain context, from a specific context, from a specific database. And then the question is, what do we want to render out of it, and how? And while we are designing these chairs, this type of objects, so we don't think about the classical details of what is the height of the objects, what is the material of the object, how is the seat positioned, and all this kind of classical way of thinking when we approach design, or material or anything. And usually the material is something that determines a lot of things in design. But now we are able, as I said, to impose the material on it. And all these kind of virtual objects, they are, let's say, a click away from reality. So we can have many different ones. It's almost like a kind of a logistical correlation with all these different voxels. And then we can say, okay, I like this one. Now I want to have it. One click away, and I have it 3D printed in my kitchen. Of course, it's a little bit too small, but I get a bigger printer, I can have it bigger. And then funny things can happen with this is, for instance, how you see with this plant that you have all these leaves which are kind of decaying and so on, and you are able to synthesize artificially these kind of things. You have a decaying chair, whatever this means. So it's a kind of a chair between the worlds. And I think it's important to emphasize that context and stories are crucial when we deal with this kind of objects, with informational objects. Because the stories empower objects, and I think our objects, they grow better with stories. If we are able to tell stories, these objects become meaningful in a different way. So they articulate what we call real or what we call reality in a way. And I think with information technologies, avatars, and these kind of stories, they can help us to think about objects in the 21st century. So how are we able to deal with the lot? So this is a kind of a context. So, but what about if we start thinking about architecture? So a lot of architecture. So if we want to look at architecture, for instance, in terms of blogs or in terms of images, yeah, there is huge amount. And now if we start looking one by one, there is no way to look all of this, because there are so many different kind of design objects, so many different articulated houses. Each house is in a different style. Each style has a certain theoretical background. They all are in cities. Each city has a certain flavor. Some cities are sustainable, some are smart, some are generic, some are like this, some are like that, and so on. So how do we start looking at architecture if all of this is available? Huh? And it's here, and we are playing with this. The interesting thing is that this idea is not so new. Yeah? So that all these kind of masters of the 21st century, they were all directly addressing this. It starts, I mean, it's a kind of a story. It starts with Mies. Mies says, okay, less is more. Yeah? So he talks about more, but in an inverse manner. And then you have all these later guys that come and they say, no, more is more, less is a bore, mess is more, I'm a whore, and so on. And these guys are all these kind of super important guys. Yeah? Venturi, Johnson, Kohlhaas, Bjarke Ingels, and so on. So they were all directly addressing these questions. Each one had a specific parole or a kind of sarcastic way of dealing with this. So I call it a spectrum of architectural cliches. So now our question is, how do we step out of this and not compete with them? So it's not the point that I make a better parole. I say, okay, more and more and more and more is more. So this is not the point. So we should find another way how to approach this. How to look at this generic world without directly judging it, but working with it. So how do we scan, like, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years of architectural expressions and tell stories about it? How can we even imagine what these stories might be about? How do we develop an attitude? And I think here, these kind of aliens, migrants, avatars, Google, social media, all this, they are already playing this game. So this can be a kind of a reference to see how to behave, how to walk, and to see what's going on. And here is my fantasy. So I say I want to play with information. I want to store, deal, emit, and receive. I want to look at the plenty of images and texts around architecture. But of course, the problem is if I start looking, there is not enough time. So if I take each text, and if I take each image, there is no time to see them all. So then I have to choose what to see. So let's put it in a different way. So I want to be informed without reading the texts or looking at the images, but still have an idea of what's going on. So I want to scan 10 years of online architectural publishing in one afternoon and imagine different weathers and atmospheres that it can produce. Because it's not about looking in detail, but it's about getting certain kind of atmospheres, weathers, flavors, tastes, and so on of what's going on. And then we can go in detail and work out things. So how can I write, for instance? How can I write about architecture if I have infinity of books at my fingertips? Or let's put it more, if I have all the books in my library. And I want to play without reading them. And I want to meet their friends, and so on. So in order to start playing with this, I put it in two steps, which is one is kind of an encoding, and the other one is articulating. Encoding is a way how to access and how to grasp this multiplicity. And articulating is then about articulating from it certain characters, certain flavors, weathers, and so on, and then tell stories dramas, or whatever you like. So of course this is a kind of a speculation, and it's just one way how one can access and play with these things. Okay, so let's start, for instance, with encoding and playing with images. So playing with clouds. So we want to scan 10 years of online architectural publishing in one afternoon. And for instance, here we play with ArcDaily and the Zine. These are the kind of most popular blogs on architecture. And I think since they are blogs and since they are clouds, they have these informational abilities. So we can ask, okay, what is the weather like with these guys? What is the weather in ArcDaily? What is the weather in the Zine? And so on. And of course, if we had more of those blogs, then we could have more characters, and they could expose different weathers or different atmospheres of what is currently going on or what was going on in architecture. And of course, then we can mix them in different ways and start playing with them, and by mixing and playing, they can show even more that they are capable at the moment. So let's try to scan them. Huh? So these are these two guys. And if we look at the last 10 years, what was going on, in principle, it's very funny that, for instance, when ArcDaily started in 2008, it was around 2,000 pictures per year that they were producing. Now they're producing around 35,000 pictures. So that's great, huh? So how do we start even playing with this amount of stuff? How do we collect, curate, mediate, or measure these images? Or if we want it in a more poetic terms, how do we start behaving in the cloud? So if we think that this cloud is a kind of, let's say, a novel public space or a digital agora or something like this, a kind of a new atmospheres, what are the laws? How do we behave? And this is the interesting that there is no way of behaving, which is a kind of established. There is no commonality for the cloud yet. And what we think at the chair, in principle, that this kind of digital weather is a part of a new kind of a literacy, of a quantum city on an informational planet with a new kind of citizens, let's say digital citizens. And now the best part is that this is not only reserved for Google, Facebook, Instagram, and social media and so on, but in principle, anyone can start playing with this stuff. And it's not difficult, yeah? So you have to say, okay, I will scan everything, I will behave like a person, I will behave like a crawler, I will be like Google, and suddenly you have thousands, millions of these informational objects, and you can start talking to them and playing with them. Yeah. So you can use machine learning, you can use whatever you like. We call it a kind of a writing of poems. Yeah, and these poems then give you a certain ability to play with information. So let's take what's public from online publishing. And the first step is the first poem. And the funny thing is that it's not too complicated. Yeah? You need to write a crawler, a small program, and to collect everything from ArcDaily. And to collect everything from ArcDaily, it's this. This is the code for collecting. You run it, you say, okay, what's on ArcDaily today? Today we have these 20 links. Let's look what is in the first article. Currently, I'm only interested in images. Yeah? Okay, so these are the images from the first article. And now if we go to ArcDaily, yeah, we check. That's it. These are the images. Second article. Other images. Yeah? Now we put it in a loop, and we get all. No problem. So one poem, 10 years of publishing on your computer in one afternoon. Write another poem, another magazine, you have the Zine. Write another one, you have Sucker Punch. Write another one, you have in Habitat or whatever. Huh? You are able to create these different characters. And then, yeah, now we have, let's say, we ran this one poem for ArcDaily, we ran one poem for the Zine, and now we have 500,000 of images. So what do we do now when you have 500,000 of images? That's interesting. So to start working with this 500,000 of images, here I call it kind of encoding or encrypting. So to play this informational play, Arc Daily and Dezeen, they become a kind of identities. They become characters, personas, clouds. And they then are able to produce, as characters, different atmospheres. So they can be happy, they can be angry, they can talk to each other, and so on. But in order to do it, they need to be translated or encoded into numbers, into something that the machine can work with, yeah? And then the weathers can develop. So how do we measure a cloud? How do we measure, for instance, the Dezeen? What is the unit of it? So the interesting thing here is that there is no universal unit with which we can measure. In a way, we need to articulate the measure and the unit for it. But I think what is the most important thing here is that it's not directly about measuring, but it's more about encoding and decoding. And then I think we are in a much more relaxed setup, because there is no right or wrong way how we can encode an image. So it's about making profiles, and it's about mixing of these clouds. So it's a different game. We are not seeking for specific properties, but we are seeking for a way how to encapsulate many different properties. Not all, but yeah, all is not a good, yeah, but many of different things. So these kind of things we have, for instance, with electricity. It's kind of energy, matter, and information. It can be a wave and a particle, depending how we want to have it. And I think it's similar with encoding of informational objects. So how do we make profiles of blocks to look at them from the perspective of images? How can an image become a character in articulating a block? Then we can take, for instance, some of these images from here. Let's take this one. We can put it here and say, okay, now I want to encode this image. I want to make it a vector out of it. And I can do it in different ways. So for instance, one way is to take, one way is to take this image like this, and then, for instance, say, okay, let's imagine that this image has 4 pixels, and I just want to see the colors of these 4 pixels, or I want to count the edges, or I want to get kind of generic measures of an image, or I can have a Fourier transform of this image. But now he's a little bit angry. Sorry, just a second. Okay, let's try another time. But in principle, what we should get out of it, if this starts to work, nope. what we should get out of it is a set of numbers. Okay, yeah, now it's good. So what we get out of it is a set of numbers. For instance, let's put here for the color 5, and here 5 is going to be more clear. Yeah, so if we look at this image in terms of colors, then we get, let's say, 5 by 5 pixels, and then each pixel is encoded in 3 numbers. So this would be a kind of an encoding of colors. Or we can take image and then split it in a random amount of parts, and then just count the white pixels. Then we get a kind of a structure of an image. So these would be these kind of numbers here. Or we can take some kind of generic measures that Mathematica has and have it like this. Or we can do a Fourier transform on an image, get another kind of set of numbers. Here you have even the imaginary numbers. Or we can do this kind of image identify and then get a kind of a textual explanation of what is happening with an image. Of course, this should work with other images. Yeah. Then if we think it's too big or too small, we just change. And now we can say, okay, I would like to have these 2 lines as an encoding of my image. This is what I like. So what is interesting here is that this kind of encoding of images is in principle open. So we can have these 2 or these 3 or all of them, and how many numbers you want to have. This all depends on the later processes you will do. So if it's too many numbers, then it's going to be kind of hard for the computer. If it's less, maybe the result's not going to be good. But then you play with this, and how you encode an image is in principle up to you. So it's in a way beyond objective and subjective. There is no good or bad here. You have to, it's good enough or it's not good enough. It's more like this. So these encodings, they don't define what is an image, but they provide a kind of a ground or a context for later articulation. And the act of measuring of an image becomes just one small part of the whole encoding process. So I would say it's a kind of an opening up of a communication channel. And what I like here is that, in a way, this kind of cryptographic moment, the moment of measuring and the moment of communication are interwoven in, let's say, a very delicate way. And now we take this kind of, let's say, these 2 lines for all the images from ArcDaily. And then we get something which I call an informational phase of an ArcDaily, or informational phase of a blog. So this means that here we have all the images, and then for one image, this would be our encoding set system. So we encode it into these numbers. And if we look at it vertically, so this column is just one index, but for all the images. And then suddenly we are able to play with millions of images, because we kind of are able to grasp them without knowing anything about them in principle. And I think this is a kind of a beauty of encoding of these objects. And the other interesting thing is that these kind of techniques, they work with different kind of media. So for instance, if we go to text, since we are working with images and text, why is my internet not working? Yeah. Okay. So if we want to do a similar thing with start playing in a similar way with text, so how do we make an informational phase of a library or informational phase of a book? So instead of now images, blogs, and numbers, we have a kind of texts, libraries, books, and numbers, and words. So what is interesting here is that each word can become an index, how we index the text. So each word can become something with which we in a way measure, but better to say index the whole text. So there are no more, in principle, there are no more exceptions, but we can integrate everything. We can integrate all the words. And then we just start counting. And we always count in the library. So if we have, for instance, a library, in this library, these, what you see in the beginning, are all the words from the library. And then we start counting and say, okay, the word architecture appears in the first book 28 times, in the second book 24, in the third 3 times, in the fourth 368 times, and so on. So what is interesting here is that with this kind of measuring of the library, what we get at the same time, we get an index to the book, which is this, yeah? Actually, like this is an index to the book, and like this is an index to the library. So we had both at the same time. And the major difference between this and how I was working with the images is that this kind of measuring is always contextual to a specific environment, so to a specific library. While with books, with images, this was still a little bit external. And of course, again, it's like with the images, there is not only one way of indexing, but you can do it in many ways. So we can index it by letters as well. Yeah? So if we just count all the letters, or if we count 2 words together, like bigrams, we get different kind of indexing, yeah, or measuring. And this kind of matrix or metrics that we can apply to a library, again, is not fixed. So it depends how we want to have it, what is the quality of our generic apparatus with which we can look at the library, and then how do we encode it. Yeah? And these metrics, different kind of metrics, don't have to belong to the same kind. So we can have a kind of a Google rating or a Kindle rating of these things, and still it works. So I think with this we can see that the way how we encode and create these informational faces is in a way algebraic. So it's open to put it in different kind of constellations, yeah, to play with them. They can transform from words to letters, from letters to synonyms, then to antonyms, to Google, Kindle ratings, and so on. Very similar like what was happening with the images. And then we can render them in different ways, the whole library. For instance, here we have a library of 100 prominent architects that talk about architecture, each one with a small text or a small interview or whatever. And then you can see how some of them are more about projects, some of them are about materials, some of them are about building, about urban, about cities, about architecture, and so on. So you get a kind of a feeling of what's going on. Or we can render them in different ways, yeah? So as graphs, as connectivity of different words. And when we have these informational faces and the ability to access them in this way or to talk to them in this way, we can start asking them different questions. So for instance, we can text the library and we can ask it a question like what is a city or what is architecture? And these guys are out of context, and the thing they will reply is out of context as well. Yeah? They don't know what's going on. And if they have something to say, they will say. But what is the beauty of it? That the whole library replies. So it's 100 of them, and they all say something if they have something to say. Huh? So we ask them, for instance, what is a city? Now they are thinking, and then they start answering. Yeah? And you have all these guys who are telling you different things about the city. So Aravena says, we have seen that the city is a shortcut towards equality. Great. Roti says the real-time city is real. Rati. Huh? So, and then if you know what they are about, you kind of have its different flavor. This guy is a little bit more activist. This guy is a little bit more about kind of understanding what the city is about. Then I don't know, you have different kind of, these guys, they say the whole city is mainly asphalt and concrete. Eisenman says, okay, for Rossi, the city is theater of human events. Aureli says something else. Kohlhaas is about the generic city and so on. But what I think is beautiful here is that you get a kind of a spectrum of different architects talking about the city. So you can get a feeling of what today people have to say about city. And then you can say, okay, I like this more, I like this less, I will read this book, I will not read this book, and so on. Or you can ask a different question with architecture. You get another spectrum. So what I find really interesting here is that you don't work with a single text, but you always work with a library. And you work in different ways with accessing this library. And what... it's here. What we did as well was, so where do you find all these books? Yeah, so they are online, but what we did at the chair in collaboration with the chair of architectural history is that we created a small library of architectural books. You have 300 books here on architecture, and in principle you can all access them and start playing with them. So you click here, okay, it's Alberti, we have Alberti, you have a PDF. If you want, you have text, and with your ETH accounts you can log in and you have access directly to 300 books on architecture, which should surely help you with your work. Okay. So this kind of setup that we've created, I think it's a kind of a stage which has two important things. This I would call a kind of a generic machine, and this is the data, or these are the actors. Actors, and here I mean an actor can be a library, or an actor can be a book or a character, however you want to call them. And then by relating these two things, by having them in circle, you get these actors to start talking. Yeah? They start talking, expressing their thoughts, and so on. And how they are talking always is a part of the library and the way how you look at the library. So how do you look and what do you look? This creates a kind of a probability space for each actor to start talking. And in this way, the face of the actor or the way or the mood of these actors or these books is never determined, but it's always a part of a specific context and of a specific way of looking at the context. So in this way, these actors, they are always in a kind of a drama, always doing something, talking in a kind of noisy environment. And I think in this way we are beyond objective and subjective, beyond this kind of practical and poetic. We are in a way lost in the infinity of lists, but we are able to start playing, start articulating, playing with these books. So what's happening at the stage when these books start talking to each other is something that we can say, okay, objects in the distance, they change their skins, they send one another kisses. So I like this a lot. And these objects, these are our actors. So they kind of kiss each other in different ways. Because what's happening is that similar books or similar indexes, they kind of like each other and they try to go together. And if now we want to see this in an explicit way, so this is a kind of a library. And in this library, each of those things is one book. And now these books are kind of negotiating between each other, and they're talking, and each one is taking a specific position. So what is in the background are words that we counted before, and these words are trying to find the similar words. And the coloring is a specific position of a book towards these concepts in the context of the library. Now it sounds strange, but this is a kind of an atmosphere or a character of a book, what he is doing, or what it is doing. And now if we look at the whole library at once, then each of those is one book. And the highlight represents a specific interest of this book. So what is it kind of most interested in within the context of this library? If we would have a different library, then these books would change their mood. So they would say, okay, in this library I will behave like this, in the other library I will behave in a different way. Now let's try to look at them a little bit more in detail. For instance, if we take these two books, we take Alberti and we take Cardino. So what is interesting here is that the point of interest of both books is at the same place. So this would mean that they, in the context of this library that we are looking, that they are talking about same things. So then if I would somehow try to say what is the relationship between them, I would say that they are in love. Or for instance, if we have two other books, Zizek and the Holy Bible. So what you can see here is that their interests kind of try to run away as far as possible as they can. So we could say, okay, this is kind of hate. But these are very arbitrary ways of talking about these things. So you can interpret this in any way you like, but there should be a kind of consistency in what you are talking about. So for instance, if we have another more complex relationship between two books, so this is Lyotard, The Postmodern Condition, and Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil. So here we have like a set of interests which are on the left side, and here a set of interests which are on the right side, but somehow if they're going one from the left, the other to the other side, I would say that they're kind of flirting with each other. Yeah? And now if we want to see actually a little bit more in depth what's going on, let's imagine that we just take the colors out. So remove the colors and just leave the words. Because what is behind each of those guys is a library which is common to all of them. So we just remove the coloring and we get the library behind. So this would be a kind of, I call it a galaxy of concepts. So this is a galaxy of concepts of a specific library that we have. And this, each concept is one cell. Or I call these concepts as well atom letters. So it's a kind of, let's say, a hesitation between a number and a letter. It has qualities of both. And what is the resolution, the size of this galaxy of concepts? It's in principle arbitrary, and it depends on what we want to have. So it can be bigger, it can be smaller, it doesn't matter. And now we are talking about texts and images, so let's try to find in this library the atom letters or the concepts which are about texts and images. So now we zoom in a little bit and we say, okay, so this is a concept here, and inside of it it's an image. This is the index we are looking for. But now we want to see what this image is about. And if we start looking, so to understand what this concept might be about, we have to look at the neighborhood. And in the neighborhood we see it's kind of Rilke, poem, Greek, poet, preface, Platonic, memory, poetic, and so on. So I would say that the feeling is that this image in the context of this library is in a kind of a poetic context. And what about text? So not too far away from this is a concept or an atom letter with text. But now this text here is in a completely different context. So it's text, signify, metaphor, language, sign, origin, trace, signification, linguistics, right, speech, mathematics, synthetic, and so on. So we get a kind of a flavor of text which is in a linguistic context. So what I find really beautiful here is that we have this kind of linguistic context for text and a poetic context for an image. And this comes from the library. So at no point did we define what is a poetic context, what is the linguistic context, what is this, what is that. So how these small indexes, these words, how they clustered, how they came together, this was not set up in advance. This was set up by a specific way of looking and by a specific library, but not by giving its certain qualities or certain properties in advance. So there was no explicit predefined grammar, no explicit structure, and these guys formed in these ways, and they are able to give us this kind of subtlety of articulation inside of it. And now we go back. So now we say, okay, this is what we are interested, texts and images. Now we want to look which books are talking about these things. Which out of all of these books are talking about text and images? And then we get these guys as an answer. And again, what we see is that the highlight of interest of all of them is in principle on the same place. So now we can go in deeper exploration and try to see, okay, how are they talking about it? We can put a kind of a dramatic setup within these characters and start exploring what would be different notions of images or of text in this kind of context. And of course, there is a trick. So if we add or remove a certain book from the library, or if we add 5 more books, remove 5 more books, or if we change the way how we encode it, so if we don't count the words, but we count something else, and so on, then the whole setup will change. And then these books will act in a different way. So each time we change the setup, books act in a different way, and by this, what we gain is the kind of, we learn how these books behave in different conditions. Yeah? We are always taking different and new snapshots of them. And now the question is, how would, for instance, a galaxy of concepts look like if we are working with images? So because it's always the same, yeah? We are working in the same manner with images and with text. So how would it look like if it was composed out of images? What would be a kind of an atmosphere? So this is a kind of a weather. Let's look at the weather in architecture. So this would be a kind of a architectural mutant of ArcDaily and Dezeen. So it's 10 years of ArcDaily and 10 years of Dezeen mixed together to produce a kind of a weather. And in this kind of a weather, you can see there are different parts which have different kind of atmospheres. And then we can read them in different ways. And of course, this can have different renderings. Yeah? So it's another rendering. Now we have a little bit stronger here. Or it can be another rendering. It's not that well clustered. Or, okay, we say this is too confusing. I want to have it smaller. Then it's less images and so on. So we can render this as with text as we like. And now each of those cells here is a kind of an atom letter again. And it's all, yeah? It's 500,000 of images, and we are getting kind of different atmospheres. The same principle of similar indexes, now it's similar images come together. Or we can have now a different rendering. We can split the ArcDaily and Dezeen, that each one is separate. And we get a kind of, let's say, 10 years of ArcDaily only. Yeah? And then if we zoom, we go to a certain place, there is a certain atmosphere. We go to another place, we get another kind of atmosphere. Go to another place, and each of those cells, each of these images has inside of itself another set of images, so a lot of them. So each one is a kind of a letter or a kind of a character with different kind of flavors. And you can now explore and play and say, okay, what I like more, what I like less, and so on. And then what I think would be interesting if we are able to take these characters, see what they are about, see what kind of flavors they have, and then start, for instance, articulating something that we like. So we have all these different images, compositions, and so on. So now let's try to go inside of, not all of them, but some of them, and see what's going inside of them. Yeah? And now when we look at this, so this each of these screens is one cell. And when we look in those cells, you can see how they're consistent. Some of them, it's explicit what it is. It's either an architectural drawing, or it's a watch, or it's this, or it's that. But with some of them, they just have a kind of a flavor or a consistency in themselves, which we never had to expose in advance. And each one of them can be thought of as a flavor, or each one of them can be an independent Instagram account, which would be kind of super consistent in the story it's telling. And then you can say, okay, when I'm designing, or like, I would like to have this kind of atmosphere, I would like to add the other atmosphere, and so on. So it's almost kind of a creating of a vocabulary of characters with which later we can start articulating and playing. And now we want to try to do it in a way. So I want to create a mask or an image how I want to look at the world at one morning, by saying about things that I like more, or what I'm associated, or depending on the mood I have, what I would like to have more or what I don't like. So outside of this, let's check what we like or we don't like. So I said, okay, what I like are the patterns. So this kind of complex stuff with a lot of patterns. I like architectural drawings as well. I like these houses that are on green meadows. These are also patterns. I would like this, and I like these things, but I don't know exactly what they are. So what I want to do now is to set this up as a filter for looking at ArcDaily or the Zen, or both of them, or whatever I'm looking at. So it's a kind of my taste of the day. So my mask. So and then I get, let's say, I get this. This would be my mask, how I want to look at internet on one morning. The next morning I will have another mask. So I say, okay, this in principle it's working. I have these things that I like. But of course, I can change them. So if there are certain things I don't like, for instance, this, I just remove it. So I'm able to create different masks depending on how do I feel. And I think with these kind of settings, we are in principle beyond direct representation. So we are able to articulate and play with flavors, different aromas, and so on. So I would say we are in a setup of narrating, infusing, talking, playing with characters, playing with elements, playing with pixels, voxels, and so on. So it's a kind of a play with flavors on a cloudy day where you have a lot of informational clouds. Thank you.